I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd end up crying in the parking lot of a trendy Austin coffee shop at 45, watching my business partner and former lover walk away with everything we'd built together. But there I was, mascara streaking down my cheeks, clutching divorce papers that weren't even for a marriage but felt just as devastating. Chen had just told me I was too set in my ways and too old to pivot with the market, as he dissolved our sustainable fashion company and walked away with our biggest investor and half our client list. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were outside Caffé Medici on Guadalupe, the same place where we'd first sketched out our dreams for EcoThreads on napkins 3 years earlier. Now those dreams were crumbling faster than the South Austin gentrification that had priced out half our friends. David stood by his sleek Tesla, his arm around Jessica Wong, a 28-year-old marketing guru with perfectly highlighted hair and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told you're past your prime. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph that made my stomach turn. "Sarah, you have to understand," David had said just minutes before, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "The sustainable fashion industry is moving toward younger demographics. Jessica understands TikTok, Instagram Reels, all the platforms where our customers actually are. You're brilliant at design, but let's be honest. When was the last time you even posted on social media?" The words hung in the humid Texas air like a death sentence. Too old at 45. Too old for the company I'd co-founded. Too old for the man I'd thought I might marry. Too old for the industry I'd helped pioneer in Austin's growing fashion scene. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The devastating blow had actually been building for months, though I'd been too naive or too hopeful to see it coming. It started with small comments from David about staying current and adapting to new market realities. Then came the subtle exclusions from meetings with investors, the decision-making conversations that suddenly happened without me, the way he'd defer to Jessica's opinion on marketing strategies, even though she'd only been consulting with us for 6 weeks. I should have seen the writing on the wall when David started calling our design aesthetic dated and suggesting we needed to freshen up our brand identity. EcoThreads had been my baby from the beginning. I'd developed our signature upcycling techniques, built relationships with local artisans, and created a supply chain that turned discarded textiles from Austin's thriving music scene into high-end fashion pieces. We were making festival wear from vintage band tees, transforming old curtains into flowing maxi dresses, and turning discarded denim into structured blazers that sold for $300 apiece. But David had grown restless with our boutique approach. He wanted to scale faster, reach younger consumers, and embrace what he called digital-first marketing. That's where Jessica came in, with her perfectly curated Instagram feed and her ability to turn everything into quote-quote content. Within weeks of her arrival, our cozy warehouse studio in East Austin started feeling like a foreign place to me. Suddenly there were ring lights everywhere, every work session was a potential photo opportunity, and our artisans were being asked to perform their craft for live streams, instead of simply creating beautiful pieces. The final confrontation had happened that morning in our shared office space above the warehouse floor. David had called it a strategic realignment meeting, but I knew from his body language that this was an execution. Jessica sat beside him, taking notes on her rose gold laptop, while I faced them across the reclaimed wood table we'd bought together at the Round Top Antiques Fair. "The numbers don't lie, Sarah," David began, sliding a folder of financial projections across the table. "Our growth has plateaued. We're not reaching the 18 to 34 demographic that drives purchasing decisions in sustainable fashion. Jessica's research shows that our current brand positioning appeals primarily to women over 40, which is a shrinking market segment." I'd stared at him in disbelief. Shrinking market segment? David, women over 40 have disposable income. They're the ones actually buying sustainable fashion, not just posting about it for likes. Our customer base is loyal, engaged, and willing to pay premium prices for quality pieces. Jessica had looked up from her laptop then, her expression patient but condescending. "That's exactly the kind of outdated thinking that's holding EcoThreads back," she said, her voice sweet but sharp. The future of fashion is about influence and virality. One TikTok video from the right influencer can move more inventory than months of traditional marketing to older demographics. The way she said older demographics made it clear she was talking about me as much as our customers. At 28, Jessica belonged to the generation that had grown up with social media, that understood the mysterious algorithms that could make or break a brand overnight. At 45, I was apparently a relic from the analog age, someone who still believed in craftsmanship over content, quality over quantity, authenticity over algorithmic optimization. What exactly are you proposing? I'd asked, though I already knew the answer from the careful way they were avoiding eye contact. David cleared his throat and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about restructuring for optimal growth trajectory and leveraging core competencies for maximum market impact. Stripped of the business jargon, his message was simple. They wanted to buy out my share of the company, rebrand EcoThreads as Greenwear Industries, and pivot toward fast fashion with an eco-friendly marketing spin. Jessica would become the creative director, focusing on trending styles that could be produced quickly and cheaply to capitalize on social media moments. Everything I'd built, the relationships with local artisans, the commitment to true sustainability, the careful cultivation of a brand that stood for something deeper than just looking good, would be sacrificed for the promise of viral marketing and venture capital funding. They wanted to turn EcoThreads into everything we'd started the company to resist. Another fast fashion brand that used environmental buzzwords to sell disposable clothing to consumers who would forget about their purchases before the Instagram stories expired. This isn't about age, David had insisted when I'd called him out on the obvious subtext of their proposal. It's about different visions for the company's future. You want to stay small and artisanal, but I want to build something that can actually make a difference at scale. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. David had fallen in love with my vision when it suited him, when he needed my design skills and industry connections to get EcoThreads off the ground. But now that he'd learned everything he could from me, now that he'd built his own network and established his credibility in Austin's startup scene, my experience had become a liability instead of an asset. "You're 45, Sarah," he'd said finally, dropping the pretense of this being purely a business decision. Jessica's generation thinks differently about fashion, about consumption, about brand loyalty. They're digital natives who understand how to build communities online. You're incredible at what you do, but what you do is becoming obsolete. The words hit me like a physical blow. Obsolete at 45. Too old to understand my own industry. Too set in my ways to adapt to new realities. It was every woman's worst nightmare, wrapped up in startup speak, and delivered by someone who'd once told me I was the most visionary person he'd ever met. Jessica had tried to soften the blow with talk of consulting opportunities and staying involved in an advisory capacity. But we all knew those were empty gestures. They wanted me gone, completely and permanently. They wanted to erase my contribution to EcoThreads and rebrand the company as David and Jessica's brilliant innovation. The business terms they offered were technically fair. They'd buy out my 50% stake at market value, give me 30 days to remove my personal equipment from the warehouse, and allow me to keep the designs I'd created before Jessica joined the team. But fair and devastating aren't mutually exclusive. They were offering me money in exchange for my life's work, my professional identity, and my faith in the future I'd spent 3 years building. I'd sat there in stunned silence as they outlined their timeline. They wanted a decision within 48 hours, so they could announce the rebrand at the upcoming Austin Fashion Week. Jessica had already designed a new logo and brand identity, had scheduled meetings with influencers, and prepared a social media campaign that would position Greenwear Industries as the fresh face of sustainable fashion in Texas. The speed of their planning revealed how long they'd been working behind my back, how thoroughly they'd prepared for this moment, while I'd been focused on our upcoming spring collection. Every late-night strategy session between David and Jessica, every excluded conversation, every time I'd been told a meeting was canceled or postponed, it had all been leading to this moment when they would offer me a golden parachute and push me out of the plane. "I need time to think," I'd managed to say, though thinking was the last thing my stunned brain felt capable of doing. David had nodded with the magnanimous air of someone offering a generous concession. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Sarah, please understand. This train is leaving the station with or without you. We've already got commitments from investors who are excited about the new direction. Fighting this will only make things harder for everyone." The threat was clear beneath his reasonable tone. They had the funding, the business plan, and the legal framework to move forward. I could take their offer and walk away with some dignity intact, or I could fight and risk losing everything in a protracted legal battle I probably couldn't afford to win. That's how I'd ended up in the parking lot of Caffé Medici, watching my former partner drive away with my company, my designs, and my belief that experience and expertise mattered more than youth and social media followers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At 45, I was officially too old for the industry I'd helped create, too outdated for the company I'd co-founded, and too naive to have seen the betrayal coming until it was too late to stop it. The worst part wasn't the financial loss, though losing half ownership of a profitable company was certainly devastating. The worst part was the casual cruelty of being discarded like last season's trends, of having my age weaponized against me by someone who'd benefited from my experience for years. David had learned everything he knew about sustainable fashion from me, had built his reputation on the foundation of my designs and my industry relationships. Now he was using that knowledge to replace me with someone younger, prettier, and more digitally savvy. As I sat in my aging Honda Civic, watching David's Tesla disappear down Guadalupe Street, I felt the full weight of what it meant to be a woman over 40 in an industry obsessed with youth. Every gray hair, every laugh line, every year of experience that should have been an asset had instead become evidence of my obsolescence. I was too old at 45, according to the man who'd once called me a visionary, and there was nothing I could do to turn back the clock or change the fundamental economics of an industry that valued novelty over substance. The tears came then, hot and angry and filled with the bitter taste of betrayal. I'd spent 3 years building something beautiful and meaningful, only to discover that my partner saw it as nothing more than a stepping stone to something bigger and more profitable. In his mind, I was just another piece of outdated equipment that needed to be replaced with a newer, more efficient model. But as I wiped my eyes and started my car, something deeper than sadness began to stir in my chest. It was anger, yes, but also something more dangerous and more powerful. It was the fury of a woman who'd been underestimated, discarded, and written off by someone who'd never understood what she was truly capable of achieving. David Chen thought he knew what this old woman could do. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. The drive home from downtown Austin felt like navigating through a fog of disbelief. Every familiar landmark along South Lamar seemed foreign now, as if the world had shifted on its axis during that devastating meeting. The food trucks that usually made me smile looked garish and overwhelming. The murals that celebrated Austin's creative spirit felt like mockeries of my own artistic ambitions. Even the music drifting from open car windows sounded discordant and harsh. I pulled into the driveway of my modest house in the Bolden Creek neighborhood, a 1950s bungalow I'd bought with the advance from my first major EcoThreads contract. The front yard was overgrown with native wildflowers and herbs, a deliberate choice that reflected my commitment to sustainable living, but now seemed like evidence of my inability to keep up with modern standards. The neighbors, with their perfectly manicured lawns and geometric landscape designs, suddenly felt like silent judges of my outdated aesthetic choices. Marcus was home from school, his backpack thrown carelessly by the front door, his lanky 17-year-old frame sprawled across the living room couch with his laptop balanced on his chest. The sight of my son usually brought immediate comfort, but today it triggered a wave of panic. How was I going to tell him that the business that had paid for his private school tuition, his saxophone lessons, and his plans for college was about to disappear? How could I explain that his mother had been deemed too old and irrelevant for her own company? "Hey, Mom, how was the big meeting?" Marcus called out without looking up from his screen. "Did you guys finally decide on the spring collection launch date?" The innocence in his voice nearly broke me. He had no idea that his mother had just been professionally executed, that the stability he'd known for the past 3 years was crumbling around us. Marcus had been so proud when I'd started EcoThreads, bragging to his friends about having an entrepreneur for a mother, bringing classmates to our warehouse to see the design process. He'd grown up believing that creativity and hard work were enough to build something lasting. "It was complicated, honey," I managed to say, setting my purse down with hands that still trembled slightly. We're making some changes to the business structure. Marcus finally looked up, his expression shifting as he registered something wrong in my voice. At 17, he'd inherited my ability to read people's emotions, a trait that made him an excellent friend but also meant I couldn't hide my devastation from him. Mom, what happened? You look like someone died. The comparison was more accurate than he knew. Someone had died. The professional identity I'd spent decades building, the confidence I'd cultivated as a successful designer, the faith I'd had in my ability to stay relevant in an industry I loved. Sarah Mitchell, the entrepreneur, was dead, executed by a man who'd once claimed to love both her vision and her person. I sank into the armchair across from him, suddenly feeling every one of my 45 years. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, as if the emotional trauma had manifested as actual weight on my shoulders. My joints ached in ways they never had before, and I wondered if this was what aging really felt like. Not the gradual accumulation of years, but the sudden awareness that you'd become invisible to the people who once valued your contributions. David and I are dissolving our partnership, I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. He wants to take the company in a different direction, and we couldn't come to an agreement about the future. Marcus set his laptop aside and sat up straighter, his teenage instincts immediately detecting the careful euphemisms in my explanation. What kind of different direction? And why couldn't you guys compromise like you always taught me to do? The question cut deep because it highlighted exactly what made this betrayal so personal. I had taught Marcus to communicate, to find middle ground, to work through disagreements with respect and honesty. David's approach had been the opposite. Secretive planning, fait accompli presentations, and ultimatums disguised as generous offers. Sometimes adults make decisions that aren't really about business, I said, hating how inadequate the explanation sounded. David has found someone else to work with, someone younger who he thinks will help the company grow faster. Marcus's eyes flashed with the protective anger that had emerged in him over the past few years, as he'd grown tall enough to look down at me, and old enough to understand that the world didn't always treat his mother fairly. You mean Jessica, that marketing consultant who's always taking pictures of everything? She's replacing you? The fact that my 17-year-old son could see through David's professional justifications made the whole situation even more humiliating. If a teenager could recognize this as age discrimination disguised as business strategy, how had I been so blind to what was happening right under my nose? It's more complicated than that, I said, though we both knew it really wasn't. David thinks the company needs to appeal to younger customers, and he believes Jessica understands that market better than I do. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing across the small living room with the restless energy that consumed him whenever he was processing difficult emotions. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You're the one who taught him everything about sustainable fashion. You're the one who came up with all the cool upcycling techniques. Jessica just points cameras at stuff. His fierce loyalty warmed my heart, even as it highlighted how much I was going to disappoint him. Marcus believed in me completely, had never questioned my abilities or relevance. Hearing his confidence made me realize how thoroughly David's words had undermined my own self-perception. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked, stopping his pacing to face me directly. "Are you going to start your own company? Fight them for the name? Sue them for stealing your ideas?" The rapid-fire questions revealed both his faith in my resilience and his complete lack of understanding about how business relationships actually worked. At 17, Marcus still believed that justice was automatic, that good people were rewarded and bad people faced consequences. He didn't yet understand that experience could be weaponized against you, that loyalty was often one-sided, or that legal victories were expensive luxuries that most people couldn't afford. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "I need some time to figure out what comes next." The uncertainty in my voice seemed to shake Marcus more than anything else I'd said. His mother had always been decisive, always had a plan, always knew how to move forward even when things got difficult. Seeing me rudderless and confused forced him to confront the possibility that the adults in his life weren't as invincible as he'd believed. "You can't just give up," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're the smartest person I know. You built something amazing from nothing. You can do it again." His confidence was both touching and terrifying. Marcus had grown up watching me succeed, had never seen me truly fail at something important. He believed in my abilities because his entire life had been shaped by my professional achievements. If I couldn't rebuild, if I really was too old to stay relevant in my industry, what would that mean for his understanding of hard work, persistence, and the possibility of pursuing creative careers? Sometimes things change, honey, I said gently. Sometimes industries evolve in ways that leave people behind, no matter how talented or experienced they are. The words tasted bitter in my mouth because they represented everything I'd refused to believe about my own career. I'd always assumed that excellence would protect me, that building something valuable would guarantee continued relevance. The idea that I could be discarded simply for accumulating too many birthdays had never seriously occurred to me. Marcus shook his head stubbornly. That's not true. You're not some old person who doesn't understand technology. You use Instagram. You know about trends. You're cooler than most of my friends' parents. The sweetness of his defense made me want to cry all over again. My son saw me as capable and current, but his perspective was filtered through love and limited experience. David and Jessica operated in professional circles, where being, quote, cooler than most parents wasn't nearly enough to maintain credibility. That evening, after Marcus had reluctantly returned to his homework, I found myself wandering through the house like a ghost haunting her former life. Every room contained reminders of the success I'd built and was now losing. The dining room table was covered with fabric samples and design sketches for the spring collection that would now bear Jessica's creative direction instead of mine. The home office was filled with business books about sustainable entrepreneurship and fashion industry publications that I'd subscribed to religiously for years. In my bedroom, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror and paused, really looking at my reflection for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me looked tired, defeated, and undeniably middle-aged. When had the lines around my eyes become so pronounced? When had my dark hair accumulated so many silver threads? When had my body started showing the effects of too many late nights and too much stress? David's words echoed in my mind as I studied my appearance. Too old at 45. Too set in my ways. Unable to connect with younger demographics. Looking at myself through his eyes, I could see what he meant. I didn't look like Jessica, with her dewy skin and effortless confidence. I looked like someone's mother, someone who belonged in the background rather than leading a cutting-edge fashion company. The thought spiral continued as I prepared for bed, each familiar routine now tinged with questions about my relevance and future. Washing my face revealed new lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. Brushing my teeth highlighted the small imperfections that accumulated over decades of living. Even my pajamas felt frumpy and outdated compared to the sleek loungewear that influencers posted on social media. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams where I was trying to explain my design concepts to audiences who couldn't see or hear me, as if I'd become invisible simply by virtue of reaching middle age. I woke repeatedly throughout the night, each time feeling more anxious about the 48-hour deadline David had imposed for my decision. The next morning brought no clarity, only the hollow realization that I had to face another day of pretending everything was normal while my professional world collapsed around me. Marcus left for school with the same casual goodbye he always gave, not understanding that his mother's ability to provide for his future was hanging in the balance. I made coffee and tried to read industry news online, but every article about emerging designers and innovative brands felt like evidence of my own obsolescence. The fashion world seemed to be moving at light speed, driven by social media trends and influenced by people who were young enough to be my children. How had I ever thought I could keep up? My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Rodriguez, my best friend and fellow entrepreneur who ran a successful catering company in Austin. Coffee this morning? I have a feeling you need to talk. Lisa's intuition had always been uncanny, and I found myself grateful for her invitation even as I dreaded having to explain what had happened. We met at Radio Coffee on Barton Springs Road, a local favorite that embodied the Austin spirit of creativity and independence that had initially drawn me to start my business here. Lisa took one look at my face and immediately ordered us both extra-large lattes, with an extra shot of espresso. "Okay," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "Tell me everything." And don't try to minimize it. I can see from your expression that whatever happened yesterday was devastating. The story poured out of me in disjointed fragments, interrupted by occasional tears and long pauses as I tried to find words for the humiliation I felt. Lisa listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail about David's betrayal and Jessica's casual dismissal of my contributions. "That manipulative little snake," Lisa said when I finished, her voice tight with fury. "He used you to build his reputation, and now he's throwing you away like last week's leftovers. And that girl. God, the audacity of someone who's barely been in the industry for 5 minutes telling you that your approach is outdated." Lisa's anger on my behalf was both comforting and painful. It validated my sense of betrayal while also highlighting how completely I'd been outmaneuvered by people I'd trusted. If the situation was as obviously wrong as Lisa suggested, why had I been so powerless to prevent it? "The worst part is that they're probably right," I admitted, stirring my latte unnecessarily to avoid meeting her eyes. "Maybe I am too old to understand what younger consumers want. Maybe my approach is outdated. Maybe Jessica really does have insights that I'm missing." Lisa reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her grip firm enough to force me to look at her. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, I have never heard such garbage come out of your mouth in the 20 years I've known you. You are 45 years old, not 85. You are at the peak of your creative abilities, with enough experience to know what works and enough energy to execute your vision. David didn't leave you because you're obsolete. He left you because he's a coward who would rather steal your ideas than give you credit for them." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear, but they also felt impossible to believe. The voice in my head that sounded increasingly like David kept insisting that Lisa was just being a loyal friend, that the truth was actually much harsher than she was willing to acknowledge. "Look at you," Lisa continued, her voice getting stronger with conviction. "You've spent the last 3 years building something from nothing. You've created designs that other companies are copying. You've established relationships with suppliers and customers that David never could have managed on his own. You've proven that sustainable fashion can be both profitable and beautiful. None of that disappears just because some insecure man decides to trade you in for a newer model." The phrasing struck me as particularly apt. David had approached our business relationship with the same mentality that led men to divorce their wives for younger women, the assumption that newer automatically meant better, that experience was a liability rather than an asset. "But what if he's right about the market?" I asked. "What if sustainable fashion really is moving toward younger demographics? What if Instagram and TikTok really are more important than actual design skills?" Lisa laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Sarah, you know what the problem is with people like Jessica? They think marketing is the same thing as substance. They can create a viral video about sustainable fashion, but they can't actually create sustainable fashion. They can talk about upcycling, but they don't know how to transform a vintage concert tee into a structured blazer that women will treasure for decades." She paused to take a sip of her latte, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "David thinks he's being smart by choosing flash over substance, but he's going to learn the hard way that customers eventually want products that live up to the marketing. Jessica can get people excited about the idea of sustainable fashion, but you're the one who knows how to deliver on that promise." Her confidence was infectious, but it also highlighted the central problem I was facing. Even if Lisa was right about my abilities, even if David was making a mistake by prioritizing marketing over design, the immediate reality was that I'd been pushed out of my own company and left to figure out what came next. "So what do I do?" I asked. "I have 48 hours to decide whether to take their buyout offer or fight them in court. Either way, I lose EcoThreads. Either way, everything I've built is gone." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as she considered my options. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new intensity that I recognized from the early days of her catering business, when she'd been fighting to establish herself in Austin's competitive food scene. "You don't try to save EcoThreads," she said firmly. "You let David and Jessica have it. You take their money, sign their papers, and walk away with your head held high." The suggestion shocked me. I'd expected Lisa to encourage me to fight, to suggest legal strategies or business maneuvers that might let me reclaim control of my company. "That sounds like giving up," I said. "No. Lisa replied, her eyes bright with an idea that was clearly forming as she spoke. That sounds like taking their money and using it to build something so much better that they'll spend the rest of their careers regretting the day they underestimated you. The concept was intriguing, but also terrifying. Starting over at 45 felt like an enormous risk, especially in an industry that had just told me I was too old to be relevant. Building EcoThreads had taken 3 years and nearly killed me with stress and exhaustion. Did I really have the energy to do it again? Think about it, Lisa continued, her enthusiasm building. David and Jessica want EcoThreads because they want to capitalize on the foundation you built. But they're taking a sustainable fashion company and turning it into fast fashion with green marketing. They're destroying everything that made it special in the first place. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone she used when she was really excited about an idea. What if you started a new company that was everything EcoThreads should have been? What if you took your real vision, not the watered-down version David was willing to support, and built something that showed the fashion world what sustainable design could actually accomplish? The idea sent a small thrill through me, the first positive emotion I'd felt since yesterday's devastating meeting. Starting fresh would mean I could implement all the ideas David had rejected as too niche or too expensive. I could create the truly sustainable fashion company I'd always envisioned without having to compromise my principles for the sake of rapid growth. But what if I really am too old? I asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me since David's casual dismissal. What if the industry really has passed me by? Lisa's expression grew fierce. Then you'll prove them wrong. Sarah, you've been designing clothes since college. You understand fashion history, construction techniques, and fabric properties in ways that most designers half your age never will. You've built business relationships and industry knowledge that take decades to accumulate. Age isn't making you irrelevant. It's making you dangerous. The word dangerous resonated in a way I hadn't expected. For 3 years, I'd been the safe choice in my partnership with David, the experienced designer who provided stability while he pursued ambitious growth strategies. But safety had also meant limitations, compromises, and constant justification of my creative decisions to someone who'd never understood what made my work special. What if I could build something without having to explain myself to anyone? I asked, the idea taking shape as I spoke. What if I could create fashion that was truly sustainable, not just marketing-friendly? What if I could work with artisans and customers who actually cared about craftsmanship instead of just social media content? Lisa grinned, recognizing the spark of determination that was finally breaking through my devastation. Now you're talking like the Sarah Mitchell I know. The woman who turned vintage band tees into runway-worthy pieces. The woman who figured out how to make profitable fashion from materials other people threw away. The conversation continued for another hour, with Lisa helping me imagine possibilities that extended far beyond simply replacing what I'd lost. By the time we parted ways, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's betrayal: hope. The walk back to my car took me past several of Austin's iconic fashion boutiques, and for the first time in months, I found myself really looking at their window displays instead of just hurrying past. The clothing was beautiful but generic, mass-produced pieces that followed trends without creating them. Even the boutiques that marketed themselves as sustainable were selling items that looked remarkably similar to conventional fashion, just with different labels and higher price points. A new idea began forming as I drove home, inspired by Lisa's suggestion, but shaped by my own observations about gaps in the current market. What if the problem wasn't that I was too old for the fashion industry, but that the fashion industry had become too young, too focused on speed and novelty to remember what clothing was supposed to be about? What if there was room for a company that prioritized longevity over trends, that created pieces women would treasure for decades instead of discarding after a season? What if sustainable fashion could mean more than just using organic materials? What if it could mean creating beautiful clothes that told stories, that connected wearers to the artisans who made them, that got better with age instead of falling apart? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made my decision about David's offer. I would take his money, sign his papers, and let him learn the hard way what happened when you prioritized marketing over substance. But I wouldn't disappear quietly into middle-aged irrelevance. Instead, I would build something that proved exactly what this old woman could do when she stopped trying to please people who would never appreciate her true value. David Chen thought he knew my limitations. He was about to discover that he'd never understood my potential. The crossroads decision came to me with startling clarity as I sat in my kitchen that evening, staring at the buyout documents David's lawyer had emailed over. The papers were professionally drafted and financially generous, offering me enough money to live comfortably for several years while I figured out what came next. All I had to do was sign away my rights to the EcoThreads name, agree to a non-compete clause that would prevent me from starting a similar business for 18 months, and promise not to disparage the company or its new leadership in any public forum. The non-compete clause was particularly galling because it revealed how much David and Jessica feared my potential competition. If I was truly as obsolete as they'd claimed, why would they need legal protection against my future endeavors? The very existence of that clause proved they knew I was still capable of building something successful. They just wanted to ensure I couldn't do it in direct competition with their new venture. Marcus found me at the kitchen table an hour later, still staring at the unsigned documents with a mixture of anger and determination building in my chest. My son had inherited my ability to read situations quickly, and he immediately understood the significance of the papers spread before me. "Are you going to sign them?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me with the careful neutrality he'd learned to use when discussing emotionally charged topics. "I don't know yet," I admitted. Signing means walking away from everything I built, but it also means getting enough money to start something new. Not signing means fighting a legal battle I probably can't win, but it also means not letting them dictate the terms of my exit. Marcus studied the documents with the same intensity he brought to his calculus homework, his teenage brain already working through the strategic implications of each choice. "What does the non-compete thing mean exactly?" he asked, pointing to the relevant clause. I explained how the legal language would prevent me from starting another sustainable fashion company for 18 months, effectively giving David and Jessica time to establish their rebrand without worrying about my interference. "That seems unfair," Marcus said, his sense of justice immediately triggered by the obvious inequity. "They're kicking you out of your own company and then trying to stop you from starting a new one? How is that legal?" The question highlighted exactly what made this situation so infuriating. David and Jessica were using legal mechanisms to protect themselves from competition, while simultaneously claiming that my age and outdated approaches made me irrelevant to the market. If I was really as obsolete as they suggested, why would they need 18 months of legal protection? "It's legal because I signed a partnership agreement that included provisions for business dissolution," I explained. "When we started EcoThreads, we agreed to terms that seemed fair at the time but now work in David's favor." Marcus frowned, processing the implications of contractual obligations he'd never had to consider before. "So you're trapped either way. Either you sign and can't compete, or you don't sign and they destroy you in court?" The stark assessment stung because it captured exactly how powerless I felt in the face of David's strategic planning. He'd spent months preparing for this moment while I'd been focused on designing and running the business we'd built together. By the time I understood what was happening, he'd already positioned himself to win regardless of my response. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe there's a third option I haven't thought of yet." The conversation with Marcus helped clarify my thinking in ways that hours of solitary brooding hadn't managed. Talking through the legal and practical constraints forced me to articulate exactly what I was afraid of losing and what I might be able to gain. As I tucked Marcus into bed that night, a ritual we'd maintained even as he grew too old to really need it, he offered one final piece of advice that cut straight to the heart of my dilemma. "Mom, you always taught me that the best way to handle bullies is to become so successful that their opinions don't matter anymore. Maybe this is just a really expensive lesson in dealing with grown-up bullies." His words echoed in my mind long after he'd fallen asleep, reframing my situation in terms that made action feel possible instead of overwhelming. David and Jessica were bullies, using age discrimination and legal manipulation to push me out of a company I'd built. The question wasn't whether I could fight them on their chosen battleground. It was whether I could create a new battleground where their advantages became irrelevant. I spent most of that night walking through my house, looking at the fabric samples and design sketches that represented 3 years of creative work, thinking about what Marcus had said about success being the best revenge. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I would sign David's papers and take his money, but not because I was accepting defeat. I would sign because 18 months was exactly the amount of time I needed to plan something so innovative, so perfectly executed, that it would make EcoThreads look like a practice run for my real career. David thought he was buying my silence and ensuring my irrelevance. Instead, he was funding the research and development phase of the company that would prove what sustainable fashion could become when it was guided by experience, wisdom, and the fierce determination of a woman who'd been underestimated one too many times. The signature I put on those documents wasn't surrender. It was a declaration of war. The morning after signing the buyout papers felt like waking up in someone else's life. I found myself reaching for my phone to check the EcoThreads business email account, only to remember that I no longer had access to it. The routine that had defined my mornings for 3 years, reviewing overnight orders, checking social media engagement, responding to customer inquiries, had vanished overnight, leaving a void that felt both liberating and terrifying. David had wasted no time in implementing the transition. By 9 a.m., I'd received an automated email informing me that my access to all company accounts had been revoked. The EcoThreads Instagram account, which I'd built from 0 followers to over 50,000, now displayed a new bio announcing the company's evolution into greenwear industries. Jessica's perfectly manicured hand was already evident in the aesthetic changes. Gone were the candid behind-the-scenes shots of our artisans at work, replaced by glossy product photos that looked like they belonged in a fast fashion catalog. The speed of the transformation was both impressive and heartbreaking. Within hours, 3 years of carefully cultivated brand identity had been erased and replaced with something that looked professionally polished but soulless. The new posts featured the same vintage band tees I'd taught David to source and upcycle, but they were styled with a slick commercialism that stripped away everything authentic about the process. Lisa had volunteered to accompany me to the warehouse for what David euphemistically called the transition meeting, where I would hand over my keys, collect my personal equipment, and officially transfer ownership of the physical space to Greenwear Industries. Walking into the converted warehouse that had been my second home for 3 years felt like attending my own funeral. The space looked different already, rearranged to accommodate Jessica's vision of what a modern fashion studio should look like. My workstation, with its organized chaos of fabric samples and hand-drawn sketches, had been cleared and replaced with sleek computer setups for digital design work. The wall where I'd pinned inspiration photos and customer feedback letters was now covered with a massive mood board, featuring images that looked like they'd been pulled from Pinterest rather than lived experience. David was waiting near the front entrance, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone trying to appear magnanimous while executing a hostile takeover. He dressed for the occasion in one of the sustainable blazers I'd designed for him last year, a detail that felt like salt in an already gaping wound. "Sarah, thank you for making this transition as smooth as possible," he said, extending his hand for a handshake that felt more like a business formality than the end of a partnership that had once included genuine affection. "I know this isn't easy, but I think we can both agree it's the right decision for everyone involved." The phrase "everyone involved" particularly grated because it ignored the impact on our employees, our customers, and the Austin artisan community that had become integral to EcoThreads' supply chain. David was speaking as if the company existed in a vacuum, as if changing its fundamental direction wouldn't ripple out to affect dozens of other people who'd invested their time and energy in our original vision. Jessica emerged from what used to be our shared office space, carrying a tablet and wearing an outfit that perfectly embodied her approach to sustainable fashion. Expensive pieces from mainstream brands that happened to use organic materials, styled with the kind of effortless perfection that required significant time and money to achieve. She looked like she was posing for a lifestyle blog, even while conducting business, every gesture calculated for maximum visual impact. "Sarah, I'm so excited to continue building on the amazing foundation you created," Jessica said, her tone suggesting that she genuinely believed this was a collaborative handoff rather than a hostile takeover. "I've been studying your design techniques and I'm really inspired by how you've incorporated upcycling into the production process." The condescension in her voice was almost admirable in its unconscious thoroughness. Jessica was speaking to me like I was a retired craftsperson, whose quaint methods might provide inspiration for her more sophisticated approach. She had no understanding that she was discussing my life's work, as if it were a historical curiosity rather than a living, breathing creative process. What specific aspects of the design process are you planning to maintain? I asked, genuinely curious about how she intended to translate my hands-on approach into the scalable model David had described. Jessica's smile faltered slightly, revealing that she hadn't expected me to ask substantive questions about the transition. Well, obviously we'll be keeping the core concept of upcycling, but we're going to streamline the production process to make it more efficient. Instead of hand-selecting vintage pieces and customizing each transformation, we're developing templates that our production team can follow to create consistent results at scale. The explanation confirmed my worst fears about what would happen to EcoThreads under new management. Jessica was planning to turn upcycling into an assembly line process, eliminating exactly what made each piece special. The vintage concert tee that I might transform into a fitted blazer with hand-embroidered details would become a standardized product cranked out by workers following predetermined patterns. What about the relationship with local artisans? I pressed. Elena Vasquez has been hand-embroidering pieces for us since we started. Are you planning to maintain those partnerships? David stepped in before Jessica could answer, his expression tightening in a way that suggested this conversation was veering away from the smooth transition he'd envisioned. Sarah, I appreciate your concern for our contractors, but those operational details are part of the new business strategy that Jessica and I will be implementing. We're confident that we can maintain the quality and values that made EcoThreads successful while also achieving the growth potential that the market demands. The corporate speak was impressive in its complete avoidance of my actual question. David had learned to talk around issues rather than addressing them directly, a skill that had probably served him well in investor meetings but felt like betrayal coming from someone who'd once valued my direct communication style. So you're discontinuing the artisan partnerships, I said, translating his non-answer into plain English. Jessica jumped back into the conversation, apparently not recognizing the tension that was building between David and me. We're not discontinuing them exactly, but we are restructuring them to be more scalable. Instead of having individual artisans working on custom pieces, we're developing standardized embellishment techniques that can be taught to our production team. It's really about democratizing the process and making sustainable fashion more accessible to a broader market. The buzzword salad was nauseating, but it also revealed exactly how little Jessica understood about what made handmade embellishments valuable. Elena's embroidery work wasn't just decoration, it was storytelling, with each piece reflecting her understanding of the garment's history and the customer who would wear it. Turning her artistry into standardized embellishment techniques was like reducing a symphony to elevator music. And the customers who specifically sought out Elena's work? I asked. How are you planning to serve the market segment that values authentic handmade details? David's patience was clearly wearing thin, his professional mask slipping enough to reveal the frustration underneath. Sarah, you're talking about a very niche market that doesn't support the kind of growth we're pursuing. Yes, some customers specifically requested Elena's embroidery, but those customers represent less than 5% of our total sales. We can't build a scalable business around such a small segment. The dismissal of Elena's customers as a crystallized everything that was wrong with David's new approach. Those customers weren't just sales statistics. They were the people who truly understood and valued what EcoThreads represented. They were willing to pay premium prices for authentic craftsmanship, and they created word-of-mouth marketing that money couldn't buy. But in David's spreadsheet-driven analysis, their loyalty and passion were irrelevant because they didn't represent a large enough percentage of total revenue. Those 5% of customers generate nearly 20% of our profit margin, I pointed out. They're also the ones who recommend us to their friends and post about us on social media without being paid to do it. Are you sure you want to alienate them for the sake of appealing to customers who might buy from you once but will never become brand advocates? Jessica looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, clearly unprepared for a detailed discussion of customer segmentation and loyalty metrics. Her expertise was in creating viral marketing content, not in analyzing the long-term value of different customer relationships. Look, David said, his voice taking on the edge. I remembered from our most difficult business disagreements. We appreciate your perspective, but Jessica and I have done extensive market research on this transition. We understand that change is always difficult, especially for someone who's been doing things the same way for a long time. But we're confident that our new approach will ultimately serve more customers better. The phrase, someone who's been doing things the same way for a long time, was a masterpiece of subtle ageism, suggesting that my resistance to their changes stemmed from inflexibility rather than legitimate concerns about business strategy. David was implying that my objections were emotional rather than analytical, that I was clinging to outdated methods because I couldn't adapt to modern realities. I'm not questioning your right to change the business model, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. I'm pointing out potential consequences that you might not have fully considered. Elena's embroidery work has been featured in Texas Monthly and Austin Fashion Week. When you eliminate that partnership, you're not just losing a supplier, you're losing credibility with the fashion press and the local design community. Jessica perked up at the mention of media coverage, apparently not realizing that Elena's press attention was directly tied to the authenticity of our collaboration, rather than just the visual appeal of her work. That's actually really interesting, she said. Do you think Elena would be interested in doing some kind of partnership with us for social media content? Like, we could film her working and create some behind-the-scenes content that shows our commitment to supporting local artisans? The suggestion was so tone-deaf that I actually felt sorry for Jessica. She was proposing to exploit Elena's craftsmanship for marketing content, while simultaneously eliminating the economic relationship that had sustained their collaboration for 3 years. It was the perfect embodiment of her generation's approach to authenticity, document it for social media while destroying its actual substance. Elena isn't interested in being social media content, I said. She's interested in being paid fairly for skilled labor that takes years to master. If you're not buying her embroidery work, there's no authentic story to tell about supporting local artisans. David stepped in again, apparently recognizing that the conversation was revealing more about their new business model than he'd intended to share. Sarah, I think we're getting into details that aren't really relevant to today's transition meeting. The important thing is that we all want EcoThreads, greenware industries to succeed, and we're confident that our new approach will achieve that goal. The slip between the old company name and the new one revealed how thoroughly David had already mentally separated himself from what we'd built together. EcoThreads was becoming history in his mind, a stepping stone towards something bigger and more profitable. Lisa, who had been quietly observing the exchange while helping me pack my personal equipment, finally spoke up. I'm curious about the timeline for these changes, she said. When are you planning to announce the rebrand publicly? And have you communicated with existing customers about what they can expect from the transition? Her questions were strategically chosen to highlight potential problems with David and Jessica's approach. I knew from her experience building her catering business that customer communication during transitions was crucial, and that companies often underestimated how much their existing customers valued consistency. Jessica brightened, apparently relieved to discuss marketing strategy rather than business ethics. We're planning a big launch event for Austin Fashion Week next month. The rebrand announcement will be part of a larger campaign about the evolution of sustainable fashion and our commitment to making eco-friendly choices more accessible to mainstream consumers. The phrasing was revealing in its focus on accessibility over authenticity. Jessica was positioning the changes as democratization rather than dilution, suggesting that the previous approach had been elitist rather than premium. It was a clever marketing angle that completely ignored the actual reasons why customers had been willing to pay higher prices for EcoThreads pieces. And you're confident that existing customers will embrace this evolution? Lisa asked. David answered before Jessica could respond, his tone suggesting that he'd already given considerable thought to potential customer resistance. We expect some initial pushback from customers who were particularly attached to the old model, but we believe that the majority of our customer base will appreciate the improved accessibility and consistent quality that our new approach will provide. The clinical language revealed how David had learned to think about customer relationships in purely transactional terms. The customers who might object to losing Elena's embroidery work were now characterized as people who were rather than loyal supporters whose preferences deserved consideration. What about the customers who specifically chose EcoThreads because of the unique pieces and artisan partnerships? I asked. Where will they go for that kind of authentic, sustainable fashion? Jessica and David exchanged a glance that suggested they'd discussed this exact scenario during their planning sessions. Honestly, Jessica said, we think a lot of those customers will discover that they actually prefer the consistency and reliability of our new approach once they experience it. But if they're really committed to the artisan model, there are other companies in the market that focus on that niche. The casual dismissal of our most loyal customers was breathtaking in its short-sightedness. Jessica was essentially suggesting that people who had supported EcoThreads for years should take their business elsewhere if they didn't like the new direction. It was a level of customer relations incompetence that would have been funny if it weren't so personally devastating. So you're counting on customer inertia to maintain sales while you eliminate the features that originally attracted them to the brand? I asked. David's expression darkened at my persistent questioning. Sarah, I understand that you're emotionally invested in the old way of doing things, but we're making business decisions based on market research and growth projections, not sentiment. Sometimes companies have to evolve beyond their founder's original vision to reach their full potential. The suggestion that my concerns were based on emotion rather than business acumen was the final insult in a conversation full of condescension. David was positioning himself as the rational businessman making tough but necessary decisions, while casting me as the sentimental founder who couldn't accept change. Market research is valuable, I said, but so is understanding your existing customer base and the competitive advantages that differentiate you from other companies. You're assuming that sustainable fashion consumers are interchangeable, but our sales data shows that they're actually quite discerning about authenticity and craftsmanship. Jessica looked increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation continued to focus on business fundamentals rather than marketing tactics. I think we just have different philosophies about what customers really want, she said. My research shows that younger consumers prioritize transparency and accessibility over exclusivity. They want to feel good about their purchases, but they also want to be able to afford them and share them on social media. The generational framing was another subtle way of suggesting that my approach was outdated, that I was stuck in old paradigms while they understood modern consumer behavior. But Jessica's research was based on surveys and focus groups rather than actual purchasing behavior, and it ignored the premium market segment that was driving most of our profitability. Younger consumers are important, I agreed, but they're not the only consumers. And even within that demographic, there's significant variation in values and purchasing behavior. Are you confident that your one-size-fits-all approach will appeal to the sustainability-focused subset of young consumers who are willing to pay premium prices for authentic products? David cut off whatever response Jessica might have given, his patience finally exhausted. Sarah, we're not running EcoThreads by committee anymore. Jessica and I have made our strategic decisions based on our analysis of the market and our vision for the company's future. We appreciate your perspective, but we're not looking for input on business direction during this transition meeting. The shutdown was definitive and professionally delivered, but it also revealed exactly how little David valued the expertise I'd developed over 3 years of building the company. He was treating me like a former employee offering unsolicited advice rather than the co-founder who understood the business better than anyone else. The rest of the meeting proceeded in tense silence as I collected my remaining personal items and officially transferred ownership of the physical space. Watching David and Jessica take possession of the workspace, where I'd spent countless hours developing designs and building relationships, felt like watching strangers move into my home. As Lisa and I loaded my equipment into her truck, I caught a final glimpse of the warehouse through the large windows that had once allowed natural light to illuminate my design process. Jessica was already directing workers to install additional lighting equipment for social media content creation, transforming the space from a working studio into a backdrop for marketing materials. The drive home was quiet, both Lisa and I processing what we'd witnessed during the transition meeting. Finally, as we stopped at a red light near my house, Lisa broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of what was bothering me. "Did you hear how they talked about your customers?" she asked. Like they were obstacles to overcome rather than relationships to maintain. The observation perfectly captured what had made the meeting so deeply disturbing. David and Jessica weren't just changing EcoThreads' business model. They were fundamentally altering its relationship with the community that had supported its growth. The customers who had chosen to pay premium prices for authentic craftsmanship were being dismissed as a niche market that didn't justify continued attention. They think sustainable fashion is just marketing, I said. They don't understand that for some customers, it's actually about supporting different ways of making and consuming clothing. Lisa nodded grimly. And when those customers realize that Greenwear Industries is just fast fashion with better branding, they're going to be looking for somewhere else to spend their money. The insight sparked something that had been building in my mind throughout the painful transition meeting. David and Jessica were creating exactly the kind of market opportunity that successful entrepreneurs learn to recognize. They were abandoning a profitable customer segment in pursuit of a larger, but less loyal market. What if there really is space for a company that serves the customers they're abandoning? I asked, voicing the possibility that had been forming throughout the morning. Lisa glanced at me sharply, recognizing the shift in my tone from defeated resignation to strategic thinking. You mean the 5% of customers who generated 20% of your profit margin? The ones who specifically sought out Elena's embroidery work and were willing to pay premium prices for authentic craftsmanship? Exactly, I said, feeling genuine excitement for the first time since David's betrayal. What if those customers aren't a niche market that's too small to support a business? What if they're an underserved premium market that's being ignored by companies chasing mass appeal? The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. David and Jessica were gambling that they could maintain EcoThreads' existing customer base, while also attracting new customers who wanted cheaper, more accessible, sustainable fashion. But that strategy required satisfying two different market segments with contradictory needs: customers who valued authenticity and customers who prioritized convenience. You could build something specifically for people who understand the value of what you do, Lisa said, her own entrepreneurial instincts clearly engaging with the possibility. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, you could focus on being perfect for the customers who are willing to pay for excellence. The concept was both liberating and terrifying. Building a business around premium customers meant smaller volumes but higher margins, deeper relationships but more limited reach. It was the opposite of David's scale-focused strategy, but it was also more aligned with my actual strengths and interests. I could work directly with artisans like Elena, I said, thinking through the implications. Instead of trying to standardize their techniques, I could showcase their individual skills and give customers access to truly custom work. Lisa was nodding enthusiastically now, clearly seeing the same possibilities that were energizing me. And you could focus on customers who understand the difference between authentic craftsmanship and marketing-driven sustainability. People who want their clothing to tell real stories rather than just looking good in Instagram photos. The conversation continued as we unloaded my equipment and carried it into my house, but my mind was already racing ahead to the practical questions of how such a business might actually work. The 18-month non-compete clause prevented me from starting another sustainable fashion company immediately. But it didn't prevent me from conducting market research, building relationships, or developing designs that I could launch once the restriction period ended. As I surveyed my personal equipment now scattered across my living room, I realized that David and Jessica had inadvertently given me the perfect opportunity to start over with complete creative freedom. They'd bought out my share of a company that had been constrained by their vision of rapid growth and mass appeal, freeing me to build something that reflected my actual values and served customers who shared them. The harsh truth that had emerged from the transition meeting wasn't just that David and Jessica had stolen my company. It was that they'd stolen a company that had never been allowed to become what I'd really wanted it to be. Their betrayal was devastating, but it was also liberating in ways I was only beginning to understand. For the first time since David's original dismissal, I felt something stronger than anger or hurt. I felt clarity about who I wanted to serve and what I wanted to build. David thought he knew what this old woman was capable of, but he'd only seen the compromised version of my vision that he'd been willing to support. He was about to discover what I could accomplish when I stopped trying to please people who would never understand the true value of what I had to offer. The weight of everyone's expectations settled on my shoulders like a heavy cloak in the days following the warehouse handover. My mother called within hours of the news spreading through Austin's tight-knit creative community, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and disappointment that only mothers could master. Honey, maybe this is a blessing in disguise, she said, her tone suggesting she'd rehearsed this conversation before dialing my number. You've been working yourself to the bone for 3 years. Perhaps it's time to think about stepping back, focusing on Marcus, maybe even dating again. You're still young enough to start fresh in a completely different direction. The suggestion that I was still young enough for romance but apparently too old for professional success wasn't lost on me. At 72, my mother belonged to a generation that had been taught to view career disappointments as opportunities to refocus on domestic priorities. She genuinely believed she was offering comfort, but her words felt like another vote of no confidence in my ability to rebuild what I'd lost. I'm not ready to give up on fashion design, Mom, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. This setback doesn't mean I should abandon everything I've worked toward. But sweetheart, the fashion industry is so competitive, and you said yourself that they wanted someone younger. Maybe that's telling you something important about where the market is heading. There's no shame in recognizing when it's time to try something else. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my mother offering increasingly elaborate suggestions for alternative career paths that seemed designed to steer me away from any field that might remind me of my recent failure. She mentioned volunteer work with local charities, part-time positions at retail stores, even the possibility of going back to school for something more stable, like nursing or education. Each suggestion felt like another small betrayal. Another person in my life concluding that David and Jessica had been right about my obsolescence. My own mother, who had raised me to believe that persistence and hard work could overcome any obstacle, was now gently encouraging me to accept defeat and lower my expectations. The pattern repeated itself throughout the week as news of EcoThreads' transformation spread through my social and professional networks. Friends called with condolences that sounded more like funeral arrangements than temporary setbacks. Former colleagues reached out with job leads that were clearly several steps down from what I'd been doing. Even my hairdresser, Maria, offered unsolicited advice about embracing new chapters and finding peace with life's transitions. The most painful conversation came from my older sister, Janet, who lived in Houston and had always been my closest confidant during difficult times. Janet was 52, 7 years older than me, and had recently gone through her own career upheaval when the law firm where she'd worked for 15 years had restructured her out of a job. Sarah, I'm going to tell you something nobody told me when I got laid off, Janet said during our video call, her expression serious in a way that immediately put me on guard. Fighting this is only going to make it worse. I spent 6 months trying to find another position at my level, convinced that my experience and track record would speak for themselves. But the truth is, employers in every industry are looking for younger workers they can pay less and mold to their specific needs. Janet's words hit particularly hard because she'd always been the success story in our family, the one who'd climbed the corporate ladder through sheer determination and strategic thinking. If she was telling me to accept defeat, maybe the situation really was hopeless. What did you end up doing? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. I took a part-time consulting position with a small firm that couldn't afford someone with my full credentials, she said. It pays about half what I was making before, but it's stable, and I don't have to deal with the stress of trying to prove myself to people who've already decided I'm past my prime. The resignation in her voice was devastating. Janet had always been a fighter, someone who attacked challenges head-on and refused to accept limitations. Hearing her counsel acceptance felt like watching a champion boxer throw in the towel before the fight had really begun. But don't you miss the work you were doing before? I pressed. Don't you feel like you're wasting your expertise on projects that don't challenge you? Janet sighed, and for a moment her professional composure slipped enough to reveal the frustration underneath. Of course I miss it. I spent 25 years building expertise that I'm barely using now. But Sarah, missing something doesn't mean it's realistic to keep pursuing it. Sometimes growing older means accepting that certain doors have closed, no matter how unfair that feels. The conversation haunted me for days afterward, not just because of Janet's specific advice, but because of what her experience suggested about the broader landscape for women over 40. If someone as capable and experienced as my sister couldn't find work at her previous level, what hope did I have of building something new in an industry that had explicitly told me I was obsolete? The doubt deepened when I ran into Rebecca Martinez, a fellow designer who'd been part of Austin's sustainable fashion scene since before I'd started EcoThreads. Rebecca was in her early 50s and had recently closed her own boutique after struggling to compete with larger companies that could offer similar styles at lower prices. "I heard about what happened with David," Rebecca said when we encountered each other at Whole Foods, her voice carrying the sympathetic tone reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. "I'm so sorry, honey. The whole situation is just awful." "Thank you," I replied, unsure how to respond to condolences for a business relationship that had ended, rather than someone who had died. "Have you thought about what you want to do next?" Rebecca asked, then immediately continued without waiting for my answer. "Because I have to tell you, the market is brutal right now for independent designers. The customers who used to support small businesses are either shopping online with major retailers or buying from companies that can afford influencer marketing. There's just not enough demand for what we do anymore." Rebecca's assessment was particularly devastating because she'd been one of the most successful independent designers in Austin before closing her boutique. If someone with her reputation and customer base couldn't make it work, what did that say about the viability of starting something new? "Maybe that's exactly why there's an opportunity," I suggested, though my voice lacked conviction. "If other independent designers are closing, maybe there's less competition for the customers who still value authentic craftsmanship." Rebecca's expression softened into something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Sarah, I respect your optimism, but you have to be realistic about where the industry is heading. The customers who appreciate handmade quality are a shrinking demographic, and they're being overwhelmed by younger consumers who prioritize convenience and social media appeal over craftsmanship." The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Rebecca sharing increasingly discouraging statistics about the challenges facing small fashion businesses. By the time we parted ways, I felt like I'd been attending a wake for an entire industry rather than just discussing career options. The pattern of well-meaning discouragement reached its peak during a dinner party at Elena Vasquez's house, where several members of Austin's artisan community had gathered to commiserate about the changes happening in their respective fields. Elena had invited me specifically because she'd heard about the EcoThreads situation and wanted to offer support, but the evening quickly devolved into a group therapy session about the impossibility of maintaining authentic craftsmanship in an increasingly commercialized market. Tom Bradley, a leather worker who'd been creating custom bags and accessories for 2 decades, dominated much of the conversation with increasingly pessimistic observations about younger consumers' purchasing habits. "They want everything fast, cheap, and Instagram-ready," he said, gesturing emphatically with his wine glass. "They don't understand the value of something that takes weeks to create by hand when they can get something that looks similar from Amazon in 2 days. It's not just the customers," added Carmen Silva, a jewelry designer whose work had been featured in several high-end boutiques. "The whole retail landscape has changed. Boutique owners are scared to carry pieces that don't have immediate turnover because they can't afford to have inventory sitting on shelves. Everyone wants proven sellers, not unique pieces that might take time to find the right customer." The discussion continued in this vein for most of the evening, with each artisan sharing stories about declining sales, increasing competition from mass-produced alternatives, and customers who expected handmade quality at factory prices. By the time dessert was served, the mood had become so uniformly bleak that I wondered why anyone still bothered trying to create anything authentic. Elena, perhaps sensing that the conversation was becoming counterproductive, tried to shift toward more optimistic possibilities. "But surely there are still customers who value what we do," she said. "Sarah, your clients at EcoThreads understood the difference between authentic embroidery and machine work. They were willing to pay premium prices for custom pieces." "Some of them were," I agreed, though even my own support for the argument felt half-hearted. But David and Jessica made a compelling case that those customers represent too small a market segment to support sustainable growth. Tom leaned forward, his expression intense in the way that suggested he was about to deliver what he considered profound wisdom. "That's exactly the problem, Sarah. We're all competing for the same tiny group of customers who still care about authenticity, while the vast majority of consumers have been trained to prioritize price and convenience over quality. It's a losing battle." The phrase "losing battle" echoed in my mind as I drove home from the dinner party, feeling more discouraged than I had since the initial confrontation with David. Here were people I respected, Experienced artisans who'd been working in their fields longer than I'd been designing clothes, and they were all essentially confirming that the industry had moved beyond what we had to offer. The next morning brought an email from Amanda Foster, one of EcoThreads' most loyal customers, who'd heard about the company's transition and wanted to express her disappointment. Amanda was exactly the kind of customer David had dismissed as a niche market, a successful attorney in her early 50s who appreciated quality craftsmanship and was willing to pay premium prices for pieces that told authentic stories. "I'm heartbroken about what's happening to EcoThreads," Amanda wrote. "The pieces I bought from you aren't just clothing. They're artworks that I treasure. I still get compliments on the blazer you made from that vintage Stevie Nicks tour shirt, and every time I wear the dress with Elena's embroidery, people ask where I found something so unique. I don't understand how they can call customers like me a niche market when we're the ones who actually support businesses like yours with repeat purchases and referrals." The email continued with specific examples of how Amanda had recommended EcoThreads to friends, how she'd featured pieces in her social media posts, and how she'd been planning to order custom pieces for her daughter's graduation and wedding. Reading about the customer loyalty I was losing felt like attending my own professional funeral. "I've already tried shopping with some of the other sustainable fashion companies, but nothing compares to the quality and creativity of what you were doing," Amanda concluded. "If you ever start something new, please let me know. I'd rather wait for you to launch a new company than settle for the mass-produced alternatives that everyone else is offering." The message was simultaneously encouraging and daunting. Amanda represented exactly the kind of customer base that a new company might serve. But her email also highlighted how much work would be required to rebuild what I'd lost. Starting over meant not just developing new designs and finding new suppliers, but also rebuilding customer relationships and establishing credibility in a market that increasingly favored established brands with substantial marketing budgets. The weight of these challenges became even more apparent when Marcus came home from school that afternoon with questions about college funding that I wasn't prepared to answer. He'd been accepted to several universities, including his top choice, but the financial aid packages assumed a family income based on my previous earnings from EcoThreads. "Mom, the financial aid office is asking for updated income projections for next year," Marcus said, settling at the kitchen table with the paperwork that would determine his educational future. "I wasn't sure what to tell them about your business situation. The question forced me to confront the immediate practical consequences of my professional uncertainty. Marcus's college plans depended on my ability to maintain a certain income level, but I had no clear idea what that income might be or where it would come from. Tell them that I'm transitioning between business ventures," I said, though the euphemism felt hollow even as I spoke it. "We should know more about my income projections within the next few months." Marcus studied my face with the perceptive intensity that made him such an excellent student and sometimes an uncomfortably insightful son. "Are you worried about paying for college?" he asked directly. The honest answer was yes. I was terrified about college funding, but admitting that felt like adding another burden to a 17-year-old who was already dealing with the stress of finishing high school and preparing for adulthood. "We'll figure it out," I said, hoping my voice conveyed more confidence than I actually felt. "Your education is the most important priority, and we'll make whatever adjustments we need to make to ensure you can attend your first-choice school." The conversation continued, with Marcus offering to consider less expensive options or to take out additional student loans, suggestions that revealed how much my uncertainty was affecting his own sense of security. Watching my professional crisis impact his educational planning felt like the final confirmation that everyone else was right about the need to find something stable and predictable rather than pursuing another entrepreneurial venture. That evening, I found myself sitting in my home office surrounded by 3 years' worth of business records, design sketches, and customer feedback, trying to make sense of what had gone wrong and what might be possible going forward. The physical evidence of EcoThreads' success was overwhelming: hundreds of positive customer reviews, media coverage from fashion publications, awards from local business organizations, and financial records that showed consistent profitability and growth. But the chorus of discouragement from family, friends, and fellow artisans had convinced me that this evidence was somehow misleading, that the success I'd experienced was an anomaly that couldn't be replicated in the current market environment. Everyone seemed convinced that women my age were fundamentally unsuited for the modern fashion industry, that the skills and relationships I'd developed were obsolete, and that any attempt to start something new would inevitably end in failure and financial disaster. The breaking point came when I received a call from Dr. Patricia Huang, a business consultant who specialized in helping entrepreneurs transition out of failed ventures. Patricia had somehow learned about my situation and was offering her services to help me, quote, process the grief of business loss and, quote, identify realistic alternative career paths for mature professionals. Sarah, I understand how difficult this transition must be, Patricia said in the practiced tone of someone who delivered this type of consultation regularly. It's natural to feel angry and disappointed when a business partnership ends, especially when you feel like your contributions weren't adequately valued. But holding on to resentment about what happened will only make it harder for you to move forward constructively. The assumption that I needed therapy to accept my professional obsolescence was almost comically insulting, but Patricia's confidence in her assessment was so complete that I found myself wondering if she might be right. What types of alternative career paths do you typically recommend for people in my situation? I asked, curious about what she considered realistic options for a 45-year-old former fashion entrepreneur. Well, that depends on your financial needs and personal interests, Patricia replied, but I often suggest exploring opportunities in retail management, customer service, or administrative support. Many of my clients find that their business experience translates well to operational roles in larger organizations, where they can contribute without having to worry about the stresses of leadership or strategy development. The suggestion that my highest and best use was in customer service or administrative support felt like the final insult in a month full of professional humiliation. Patricia was essentially recommending that I accept a position several levels below what I'd been doing, trading expertise and creativity for the security of a regular paycheck and the comfort of having someone else make all the difficult decisions. What about consulting or freelance work in fashion design? I asked. Patricia's pause suggested that she was choosing her words carefully. Consulting can be challenging for professionals who are transitioning out of leadership roles, especially in industries that prioritize youth and digital fluency. Freelance work often requires a level of self-promotion and networking that many of my clients find overwhelming after experiencing business setbacks. The subtext was clear. I was too old, too damaged, and too far behind the technological curve to compete effectively for interesting work. Patricia was recommending the professional equivalent of moving to a retirement community, safe, predictable, and designed to minimize the risk of further disappointment. The conversation ended with Patricia offering to send me information about her transition coaching program, which promised to help me, quote, find peace with career changes and develop realistic expectations for professional fulfillment in the second half of life. The phrase second half of life at 45 felt like a death sentence disguised as career counseling. As I hung up the phone, I realized that somewhere during the past month I'd allowed everyone else's fears and limitations to become my own. The woman who had built EcoThreads from nothing, who had created designs that customers treasured, who had established relationships with artisans and suppliers throughout Austin, had somehow convinced herself that she was too old, too obsolete, and too irrelevant to try again. The weight of accumulated discouragement felt suffocating as I sat in my office that night, surrounded by evidence of my own capabilities, while simultaneously believing that those capabilities no longer mattered. Everyone I trusted, my mother, my sister, my friends, my fellow artisans, had essentially confirmed David and Jessica's assessment that I was past my prime and should accept a diminished role in an industry that had moved beyond what I had to offer. But as I picked up one of Amanda Foster's emails and reread her description of how much she valued the pieces I'd created for her, a small voice in the back of my mind began to ask a different question. What if everyone else was wrong? What if the circle of doubt surrounding me was based on fear rather than fact? What if the industry hadn't actually moved beyond what I had to offer, but had simply forgotten what authentic value looked like? The question was terrifying to consider because it meant rejecting the safe path that everyone was encouraging me to take. It meant believing in my own abilities despite overwhelming evidence that people my age were supposed to step aside gracefully. It meant risking further failure and public humiliation in pursuit of something that might not even be possible. But as I sat there surrounded by the physical evidence of what I'd already accomplished, One thing became clear. The choice wasn't really between success and failure, but between trying and surrendering. Everyone else had already decided what I was capable of. The only question that remained was whether I would accept their limitations or discover what I could accomplish when I stopped listening to people who had never understood my true potential. The circle of doubt had nearly convinced me that David Chen was right about my obsolescence. But doubt, I was beginning to realize, was just another opinion. And opinions, unlike facts, could be proven wrong. The crossroads moment arrived on a humid Thursday morning in late June, exactly 6 weeks after I'd signed the papers that transferred EcoThreads to David and Jessica. I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at a job posting that my sister Janet had forwarded with the subject line, "Perfect for your next chapter." The position was for a retail manager at a mid-level department store, supervising a team of sales associates and handling inventory management for the women's clothing section. The salary was adequate but uninspiring, roughly half of what I'd been earning during EcoThreads' most successful year. The job description emphasized stable hours, comprehensive benefits, and, quote, opportunities for advancement within the retail management hierarchy. Reading between the lines, it was exactly the kind of position that companies created for experienced professionals who needed steady income but were no longer considered candidates for creative or strategic roles. My laptop was open beside the job posting, displaying the draft of a cover letter I'd been struggling to write for 3 days. Every attempt to explain why I wanted to transition from fashion entrepreneur to retail manager sounded hollow and unconvincing, even to me. How could I articulate enthusiasm for counting inventory and managing staff schedules when my real passion was creating unique pieces that told stories and celebrated individual style? The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Part of me wanted to apply for the job because it represented security, predictability, and relief from the uncertainty that had dominated my life since David's betrayal. But another part of me recoiled at the thought of spending my days executing other people's visions instead of developing my own. Marcus had left for school an hour earlier, but not before stopping in the kitchen to grab breakfast and offer what had become his daily dose of moral support. At 17, he possessed an optimism about the future that I envied and found simultaneously heartbreaking. "You know, Mom," he'd said while buttering his toast, "some of my friends' parents hate their jobs but stay because they think they don't have other options. You actually have the skills to build something amazing. It seems weird to choose the safe thing when you could choose the extraordinary thing." His casual wisdom had lingered in the kitchen like the scent of his breakfast, challenging every rationalization I'd constructed about why accepting limitations was the mature, responsible choice. Marcus believed in possibilities that all the adults in my life had dismissed as unrealistic. Either he was naive about how the world actually worked, or the adults were afraid of what the world might become if people like me refused to accept defeat. The debate in my mind was interrupted by a phone call from Elena Vasquez, whose embroidery work had been one of the casualties of Greenware Industries' efficiency-focused rebrand. Elena rarely called unless she had something specific to discuss, so her voice on my phone immediately commanded attention. "Sarah, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to share something that happened yesterday," Elena said, her accent carrying the slight formality that emerged when she was discussing business matters. "I received a call from a woman named Margaret Chen, no relation to your former partner, who said she'd been trying to find someone who could create custom embroidery work for a dress her daughter was wearing to her wedding." The story that followed revealed exactly what David and Jessica had failed to understand about the market they'd abandoned. Margaret had been a customer of EcoThreads, specifically seeking out pieces that featured Elena's handwork. When she'd called the company to commission a custom piece for her daughter's wedding, she'd been told that Greenware Industries no longer offered personalized embroidery services, but could provide machine-embellished alternatives from their standard collection. Margaret told me she spent 2 hours on the phone with Jessica, trying to explain that she didn't want something from a catalog. Elena continued. She wanted a piece that reflected her daughter's personality and honored the family traditions that were important to them. Jessica kept talking about scalable solutions and, quote, design templates, but she never understood that Margaret was willing to pay premium prices specifically because she wanted something that couldn't be duplicated. The conversation had ended with Margaret asking Elena if she knew anyone who could create the kind of custom piece she was seeking. Elena had provided my contact information, along with an explanation that I was between businesses but might be interested in freelance work. "Sarah, this woman is exactly the kind of customer you used to serve at EcoThreads," Elena said. "She understands quality, she appreciates craftsmanship, and she has the budget to pay what custom work is actually worth. But more than that, she's frustrated because she can't find anyone who offers what you used to provide." The phone call forced me to confront a possibility I'd been avoiding. What if the customers David had dismissed as a niche market were actually an underserved premium segment that could support a different kind of business? What if their willingness to pay higher prices for authentic craftsmanship wasn't a liability but an opportunity? "Did Margaret say anything about how she found out about the changes at EcoThreads?" I asked. Elena's laugh carried a note of satisfaction that suggested she'd been waiting for me to ask that question. She said she'd been following Greenware Industries on social media since the rebrand, trying to understand what they were offering now. According to Margaret, the new posts look professional but generic. She said it was like watching someone take a restaurant known for handmade pasta and turn it into a place that serves frozen meals with fancy plating. The analogy perfectly captured what was bothering EcoThreads' former customers about the transition. They hadn't been paying for the visual appearance of sustainable fashion. They'd been paying for the authentic process behind it. Jessica's Instagram-ready aesthetic could replicate the look of artisan work, but it couldn't replicate the story, the relationship, or the sense of supporting something genuinely meaningful. "What did you tell Margaret about working with me?" I asked. "I told her you were exploring new projects and might be interested in discussing her requirements," Elena replied. "I hope that was okay. I know you're considering different directions for your career, but this seemed like exactly the kind of work you enjoy most." The careful phrasing revealed that Elena had heard about my contemplation of conventional employment options and was diplomatically encouraging me to reconsider. As someone who'd spent decades building her own reputation as an artisan, Elena understood both the financial pressures of creative work and the spiritual cost of abandoning authentic craftsmanship for the sake of security. "Thank you for passing along my information," I said. "I'd be interested in hearing what Margaret has in mind." The conversation with Elena continued for another 20 minutes, during which she shared similar stories about other former EcoThreads customers who were struggling to find alternatives that matched what they'd valued about my work. According to Elena, the sustainable fashion companies that remained in Austin were either following Greenware Industries' model of scalable efficiency or catering to such a high-end market that they were inaccessible to most customers. "There's a gap in the market," Elena concluded. "Customers who want authentic craftsmanship without paying thousands of dollars for a single piece. Women who understand quality but aren't wealthy enough to shop at the most exclusive boutiques." That's exactly who you were serving at EcoThreads. The insight crystallized something that had been forming in my mind throughout our conversation. The retail management position I was contemplating represented the safe choice, but it also represented surrender to someone else's assessment of my capabilities and market value. Taking that job would mean accepting that David and Jessica were right about my obsolescence, that the fashion industry had indeed moved beyond what I had to offer. But Elena's stories suggested a different possibility. What if the industry hadn't moved beyond authentic craftsmanship but had simply abandoned it in pursuit of more scalable alternatives? What if there were enough customers like Margaret to support a business that prioritized quality over quantity, relationship over reach, and sustainability of values rather than just materials? The phone call ended with Elena offering to introduce me to several other artisans who were facing similar challenges since Greenware Industries had discontinued their services. "We're all dealing with the same problem," she said. "Companies want to use our techniques but not pay for our expertise. Maybe there's a way for us to work together directly with customers, instead of going through companies that don't understand what we do." After hanging up, I found myself staring at the job posting with new eyes. The retail management position offered security, but it also offered invisibility. I would spend my days implementing other people's strategies, following corporate policies, and measuring success by metrics that had nothing to do with creativity or craftsmanship. It was the professional equivalent of agreeing to become scenery in someone else's story. The alternative was terrifying but also exhilarating. What if I used the 18-month non-compete period to research and develop a completely new approach to sustainable fashion? What if I spent that time building relationships with customers like Margaret and artisans like Elena, creating a foundation for something that could launch once the legal restrictions expired? The idea gained momentum as I considered what I'd learned from both EcoThreads' successes and its ultimate limitations. David's growth-focused strategy had required constant compromise between authentic values and scalable systems. Every decision had been filtered through questions about whether it could work at larger volumes, whether it could be systematized, whether it could attract investment funding from people who measured success primarily in financial terms. But what if growth wasn't the primary objective? What if I built something designed to serve a specific customer base exceptionally well, rather than trying to appeal to the broadest possible market? What if I prioritized depth of relationship over breadth of reach? Quality of experience over quantity of transactions? The concept was both liberation and limitation. Focusing on premium customers meant accepting smaller volumes and slower growth, but it also meant freedom from the constant pressure to compromise quality for the sake of efficiency. It meant building a business around my actual strengths, rather than trying to compete in areas where younger entrepreneurs might have advantages. Margaret Chen called that afternoon, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd been searching for something specific and finally found a promising lead. She explained that her daughter's wedding was scheduled for October, giving us roughly 4 months to create a custom piece that would incorporate family heirloom fabrics with contemporary styling. "I know this might sound strange," Margaret said, "but the dress isn't just clothing for us. It's a way of honoring the women in our family who came before my daughter. My mother's wedding dress from Taiwan, my grandmother's embroidered silk scarves, even fabric from my own wedding dress. We want to transform these pieces into something new while preserving their stories." The project was exactly the kind of work that made me passionate about fashion design. It wasn't about following trends or creating content for social media. It was about using clothing to celebrate family history and mark significant life transitions. It was the opposite of everything that greenwear industries represented. "Margaret, this sounds like an incredible project," I said, feeling genuine enthusiasm for the first time in weeks. "Can you tell me more about your vision for how these elements might work together?" The conversation lasted for over an hour as Margaret described her daughter's style preferences, the significance of each family textile, and her hopes for how the finished piece might honor both tradition and contemporary fashion. By the end of our discussion, I had pages of notes and a clear understanding of why Margaret had been frustrated by Jessica's template-based approach. "I have to ask," Margaret said as our conversation was winding down, "are you planning to start a new company? Because if you are, I know at least a dozen women who would be interested in the kind of custom work you used to do at EcoThreads." The question forced me to articulate something I'd been avoiding. Was I ready to commit to rebuilding? Or was I just entertaining possibilities to delay making the practical choice of conventional employment? "I'm exploring different options right now," I said carefully. "But I'm definitely interested in taking on meaningful projects like yours, whether as freelance work or as part of something larger." Margaret's response revealed exactly why customers like her were worth building a business around. "Sarah, I want you to know that when I was researching EcoThreads before the rebrand, I read every interview you'd ever given about sustainable fashion. You understand that clothing can be art, history, and personal expression all at the same time. That's incredibly rare, and it's exactly what women like me are looking for." After ending the call with Margaret, I found myself energized in a way I hadn't experienced since before David's betrayal. The project she described was challenging, creative, and meaningful. Everything that made fashion design feel like a calling rather than just a job. Working with her would mean accepting financial uncertainty and professional risk, but it would also mean returning to the work that made me feel most alive. The contrast with the retail management position was stark. Managing inventory and supervising sales associates would provide steady income and clear expectations, but it would also mean spending my days as far removed from actual design work as possible. It would mean accepting that my creative abilities were less valuable than my administrative skills, that my vision for sustainable fashion mattered less than my ability to implement other people's strategies. That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of completing the application for the retail management position, I closed my laptop and walked to the phone to call Lisa Rodriguez. If I was going to reject the safe choice in favor of the extraordinary one, I needed the support of someone who understood both the risks and the potential rewards of entrepreneurial thinking. "I need to run an idea by you," I said when Lisa answered. "What if I spent the next 18 months building something completely different from EcoThreads? Not just another sustainable fashion company, but a platform that connected customers directly with artisans for custom work?" Lisa's immediate enthusiasm confirmed that I wasn't being unrealistic about the opportunity. "Sarah, that's brilliant," she said. "You'd be solving the problem that Margaret described and the problem that Elena described at the same time. Customers who want authentic work can't find artisans who understand their needs, and artisans who do quality work can't find customers who appreciate what they do." The conversation that followed helped me articulate a vision that had been forming throughout the day. Instead of trying to build another fashion company that would eventually face the same growth pressures that had destroyed EcoThreads, I could create something that celebrated the limitations I'd been told to overcome. What if small scale was the point, rather than the problem? What if slower production meant higher quality? What if personal relationships with customers were more valuable than social media followers? What if the niche market that David had dismissed was actually the foundation for something more sustainable than anything he could build with Jessica? "The non-compete clause actually works in your favor," Lisa pointed out. "It gives you time to research, plan, and build relationships without the pressure of needing immediate income. You can use those 18 months to really understand what customers like Margaret want and to develop partnerships with artisans like Elena." The insight reframed the legal restriction that had felt like punishment into an opportunity for strategic development. Instead of rushing to rebuild what I'd lost, I could take time to create something better, something that reflected everything I'd learned from both EcoThread's successes and its ultimate limitations. "What would you call it?" Lisa asked. The question made me realize how fully I'd committed to this path without consciously making the decision. If I was thinking about names, I was no longer contemplating whether to start something new. I was planning how to do it. "Second Chance Designs," I said, the name emerging as I spoke it. "Because we're giving vintage materials a second chance to become something beautiful, and we're giving customers a second chance to find authentic craftsmanship in a world full of mass-produced alternatives." Lisa was quiet for a moment, processing the concept and its implications. "And you're giving yourself a second chance to build something that truly reflects your values," she added. The observation captured exactly what made this decision feel both terrifying and inevitable. David and Jessica had forced me to choose between accepting irrelevance or proving that experience could be more valuable than youth, that depth could compete with scale, that authenticity could overcome algorithm optimization. They thought they knew what this old woman was capable of achieving. They were about to discover that they'd never understood my potential because they'd never shared my values. Building Second Chance Designs wouldn't just be about creating beautiful clothing. It would be about proving that there was still room in the world for businesses that prioritize substance over appearance, relationship over reach, and quality over quantity. The retail management job remained posted online, waiting for someone who needed security more than they needed creative fulfillment. But I was no longer that person. At 45, I was apparently too old for the fashion industry as David and Jessica understood it. I was exactly the right age to create the fashion industry I wanted to see in the world. The crossroads had forced me to choose between accepting limitations and discovering possibilities. The choice I made that night would prove that the most dangerous thing you can do to a creative woman isn't to underestimate her abilities, it's to give her nothing left to lose and 18 months to plan her comeback. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.